This project came out way better than I expected, but let me rewind real quick. You ever have one of those ideas and you're just not sure if it's even going to work, but you can't help yourself from trying to do it anyway? I've got a bunch of these rigid foam panels, they're 2 inches thick, that are left over from when I was doing the ceiling in my shop, and I could throw them away, and they could sit in a landfill for the next 10,000 years, or I could try to do something with them. And this idea has kind of been building since last Halloween, when I made some tombstones out of the same material and I made them look like concrete. And after they sat outside all fall, they held up really well. So I was thinking, why stop there? Why not make something else that might look like concrete and see what's possible by making it out of foam? So I decided to surprise my wife by designing this big fountain slash planter thing, and I've been wanting to find a use for this old well pump head that we've had on our patio since we moved in. We haven't figured out what to do with it yet, so I figured I'll combine everything all into one and use up all these different materials that I have lying around. The first thing we gotta do is we gotta clean up this old well pump. This thing is solid cast iron, and so most of the rust is actually just surface rust because it just can't get through it, and it's designed to be wet in the first place. With most of the rust off, then I could switch over to get this thing ready for paint. Krylon Rust Tough paints are designed to go direct to metal, but adding the primer gives it an extra coat of protection and prevents any of that residual rust that I didn't get off from coming through the paint layer later on. Rust Tough paints are UV resistant and offer harsh weather and corrosion protection, so it's perfect for an outdoor fountain like this. I went with the forest green color because I thought it kind of tied in with the green of the house, and I didn't want to make it red because it looked too much like a fire hydrant. And then lastly, I added the Rust Tough clear coat on top to give it that final layer of protection, and we're good to go. So the idea is to build this kind of stacked box type thing. If I were to actually make this out of concrete, there would be a couple different problems. Number one, it would be incredibly heavy. And number two, it would be really hard to build a form to make this thing look like this because it's got kind of built-in planter, it's got a waterfall shelf, it's got a whole big thing. But since I'm making it out of foam, it'll both be light and I can just cut the pieces and make it however I want. The key to making this thing work is obviously to make it watertight. And to do that, I'm using a bead of 100% silicone on all the seams and joints. And the next step of the waterproofing is that I'm going to add this concrete and masonry waterproofing membrane, which does two things. One, obviously waterproofs it, just like I said. And number two, it also kind of looks like concrete. It's got kind of that sandy, gravelly texture to it that concrete looks like. And this is going to be a base coat, which I'll touch on later what I'm going to do over top of this, but it both waterproofs and kind of looks like concrete. So it checks two boxes. I've had a lot of comments over the years, people asking me how I know how to do stuff. And the answer is just trial and error. This is an example of something I've certainly never done before. And I really had no idea if it was even going to work. But what's the worst that's going to happen? I'm going to throw it away anyway. At least in this case, I've prolonged the life of the material so it doesn't just immediately go sit in the landfill and add to the incredible pile of waste that we have in our disposable society these days. Anyway, enough diatribe. Look how freaking big this dog has gotten. She's not a puppy anymore. To secure the boxes together, I used some of that silicone. Then I also used some 3-inch screws to go between them just to kind of hold everything in place. And I also used some fiberglass mesh tape, which I then added that masonry sealant over top of to kind of act like a glue to hold it in place. So the well head will sit up on top and the water will fall down into this middle box, and then there's this little shallow planter in the top, and the water will actually flow underneath that and out this little cutout that I'm putting in it, and then it'll fall into the bottom and then it'll just recycle. The top box is basically the same, it's just a little bit smaller. The only difference with the top plate is that I added a piece of 3/4 inch scrap plywood to the bottom of it so that I had something that I could bolt the well pump head to. The masonry waterproofing looks pretty good, but it doesn't hide the seams and doesn't really cover very well, so I actually added a coat of Portland cement over the whole thing, and it gave it a really authentic concrete look. Just doesn't have the aggregate in it. And then I used a sponge to wipe it all down and smooth it out a little bit, and it looks pretty legit. Before I added the top plate and got this thing buttoned up, I had to drill some holes into it and then seal around them to make sure that they're watertight so that the water in the middle box doesn't just leak out of the middle box and fall into the bottom without going over the waterfall. And then I sealed the whole thing with a couple coats of satin masonry sealer, and it looks like concrete. But the beauty of it is that I can actually move it and install it where I want to do it without having to have a big piece of equipment to move the thing around. Initially, I thought about watering down some paint and kind of dripping it on it and kind of weathering the look, but I think the weather will do that on its own over time. So I figured, you know what, just leave it alone. And then I could just get to installing the well pump and hooking everything up. My son planted some flowers for my wife for Mother's Day inside our little arrow garden, and they've been needing to be transplanted for a while now, so this is a natural place to put them. So I filled up the planters, added some decorative stone into the bottom and middle boxes to kind of give it a nicer look, filled the whole thing up with water, and lucky for me, everything's watertight because this is the first time that I tested it, and I could just adjust the flow rate on the fountain pump to get it to where I needed it to be, and this thing is finished. Now the haters are going to say, yeah, well, how long is it going to last? And I'm going to say, I think it'll last for a good long time. If anything, I know the finish on the well pump is going to last, and if nothing else, well, I can just reuse that later on. So I want to take a quick second and say thank you to Krylon for making this project possible, and to encourage you guys to get out there and try something new for yourself. Personally, I'm really happy with the way that this project came out. And for that, I consider this a mission accomplished.